Thank you, Meta. I think with the lighting, I'm going to just take it down a bit so the screen can be seen easily. Is that okay for everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So tonight I want to talk about climate change and food security. Both of them are huge topics. I'll try to work at where they intersect, and we'll see where we go. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Huron, Wendat, and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. You know, when we think about the fact that our Indigenous predecessors, and they're still here now, have been here for thousands of years and lived in harmony with the land for that length of time, there's something that we need to respect about that and pay attention to. As Europeans, we've been here just a little bit more than 400 years. When Europeans first came to Nova Scotia, arguably some came to Lanson Meadows maybe 1,000 years ago, but Europeans are relatively recent on this continent and others. And the Indigenous folks who've lived here had worked out a way to live indefinitely for a long time, and I think that deserves respect, particularly when we're talking about sustainability. Now I want to talk about context. Today we have over 7 billion people in the world, about 0.8 billion cats and dogs, not insignificant, and 1.2 billion cars, all consumers. There are 0.9 billion people who suffer from too little food, and almost twice as many who suffer because they eat too much. That's something I think we need to pay attention to. By the way, as I'm going along, if you have questions at all about what I'm saying, they're questions of fact, feel free to interrupt me. We have plenty of time tonight. I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it, and I'll address it. If I'm going to come to it later, I'll let you know, and we can do that. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for exchange as well. The other thing is that we waste about 40% of the food in North America. I've been working with a group at the University of Guelph, including Dr. Kate Tarasov and Dr. Mike Van Massau, and we've been looking at how much food is wasted. We've actually gone to the curb and picked up food and measured it, and we've divided it into the categories, and then we've gone back and surveyed people in those households, and it's amazing how complicated this wasted food issue is. Now, in my opinion, when we're looking at production, production is actually greater than food sales, and right now food sales are greater than consumption in Canada. What we want is to sustain enough production, and we want that to be equal to adequate, healthy consumption. It's a balance of production and consumption. Right now we've goosed production, and we have quite a bit more production than we do consumption. And that's led to a number of problems, including the fact that food is quite cheap. It's, in Canada, we pay less than 9% of our net income on food. And that leads to problems of taking food for granted. And I think we should not do that. Now, Plan A for 2050 is that there will be, and this is according to many people in agriculture, there will be 9 to 10 billion people by 2050. That's a 30 to 40% increase. In developing countries, average incomes will rise. They'll be consuming more meat and richer foods, particularly in Asia. And therefore, we should increase food production, not just by the 30 to 40%, but by 70 to 100%. And that's often declared to be axiomatic, as if we must proceed down that path and produce more and more. There's a plan B, We could have more and improved education for girls and women in developing countries. And we've known since the Cairo conference in 1990 that the more women and girls are educated, the fewer children they are likely to have. And if we worked on that a little bit more, maybe we could come in under 9 billion. Here, it's really important that we reduce food waste, which is 40%. I've said that before. And I'm going to be hammering this point of wasted food a few times tonight, because I think it's an important part of the picture. We could eat less meat, perhaps of higher quality, and if you want vitamin B12 and you want your protein from meat, and we have cultural and traditional reasons for doing that, I think there are a way to meet those cultural and traditional expectations, but to eat much less meat than what we're eating now. We could eat pulses. Pulses are beans and peas, and of course insects. And there are all kinds of opportunities with getting protein from insects. And insects can eat a lot of decomposing material that might not otherwise be available. Anybody know who this is? She's a wonderful woman from Kenya. Valerie Matai, right. And she had talked about the fact that she wanted to plant trees all over East Africa. And she gives the analogy of a fire and how the elephants were laughing when a hummingbird took one drop of water at a time to put out the fire. And then she said, well, I'm doing this because I want to do what I can do. In the end, they started doing what they could do with their great trunks, and they sprayed water, and they were able to put out the fire. Similarly, Valerie Matai inspired a lot of people across Africa, particularly women, and they ended up planting 11 billion trees. And when we look at our food system today, we want to build an ecological, nutrient-secure, and just food system, even while we're competing in a market of low budget allocations for food. It seems to me that a lot of people don't want to spend very much money on food. And when I talk to my farmers, the farmers that I work with, they tell me that they find it very discouraging that people will put a lot more money into this than they will into food. And they worry about people having extra disposable income going to technology rather than to food. We have to build this ecological, nutrient-secure food system before the disappearance of cheap, light crude oil, before we lose unusually benign climatic conditions. Climate has been unusually benign for agriculture, with or without human-induced climate change. This past century has been unusually benign for agriculture, and it would be unlikely that that would continue given what we've seen in the past as climate has shifted, even without what we're doing. And we're going to have to try and solve this problem as much as we can before we lose continuous economic growth. Although some would argue that that might become part of the solution.
It is the solution.
Pardon me?
It is the solution.
It is the solution. Stopping continuous economic growth. Okay, so that could be seen as a solution. Now, who are leaning in to get the job done? Who are responding to some of the things that Valerie Matai is saying? There are 500 million small-scale farmers in the world, and most of them are women. If we were to give women equal access to farmland and materials, there could be 100 to 150 million fewer people in Hungary. This was a report by Michelle Bachelet. She's now the president of Chile. She was before. She had to take a term off. She worked at the UN, and when she was there, she asked for this report, and now she's back as a president of Chile again. There are many, many more farmers in developing countries than what we have here, And let's keep in mind that a lot of them are women. CAPI is the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. They're in Ottawa. And a few years ago, 2009, they came out with a report that indicated that 2/3 of healthcare costs can now be attributed to chronic diseases, think diabetes, associated with unhealthy eating. So, I said before, you may remember in one of my opening slides, as part of the problem, there are 0.9 billion people suffering from eating too little food. 1.6 billion, or almost twice as many, are suffering because they're eating too much. And part of the too much is because it's the wrong type of food. Now, I think that the food industry is partly responsible for this. They're promoting all kinds of foods and beverages that are high in sugars and fats, and yet low in recommended nutrients. The annual global spending on soft drinks is 200 to 400 billion. Is that really where we want to aim with our food productive capacity? Now, if I had my druthers, and I was the Minister of Education in Ontario, and maybe the Minister of Health, I would say that we should develop a program that works along with this hypothesis. It'll be cheaper to provide free Ontario fruits and vegetables to all low-income citizens than it will be to keep paying their health costs if they continue with their current diet. And we've proposed to do a research project to test this at the University of Guelph. I've tried twice, and I've been turned down twice. Most times when I develop a research program, I have to, the ones that are really good, I have to apply 2, 3, or 4 times before I can get the funding. So we're going to try again this fall. So hopefully, if I come back a year or 2 from now, I can tell you how that research is going.
Which funding agency are you applying to?
Well, we had applied to OMAFRA, that's the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Rural Affairs. We've applied to the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and now we are going to be applying to the Maple Leaf Foundation. And we're hoping that they will fund it. There's some indication that they're quite interested in this.
You're not applying as a SHRC grant?
Well, we haven't been applying for when we apply, this gets into the complicated issues of funding. I am not really eligible for SHRC because I'm in plant agriculture. And really, this type of funding should be Tri-Council. It should be, Canadian Institute for Health Research. It should be SHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council. It should be Natural Science and Engineering Research Council. I'm NSERVable, and when I apply to SHRC or CIHR, they tend to say, no, you're not supposed to apply here, you're supposed to get your money there. But this is the kind of project that really should be funded by the Tri-Council. At any rate, if we do get it funded, I think we can make this case. And the way that we would propose to make this work, should the research show us what we expect it to, is that we could give all low-income people a card, and they could even use it at farmers markets or grocery stores. We could give farmers markets vendors card readers, and these cards would provide low-income people with an allocation for Ontario fruits and vegetables every month. Now, I just want to stop there a minute and give you a chance to talk to each other I'm just going to give you 2 minutes, and I just want you to talk to one another, maybe in pairs or in groups of 3, however you decide to do it, and see whether or not you think this idea has legs. So go ahead, have a chat.
Could I ask you, how would you demonstrate this? I mean, the bad health effects of overeating normally don't manifest themselves until you're an old guy like me. So you need a study for 30 or 40 years. I mean.
Yes, the question is, but what we actually need to study for 30 or 40 years. All we want to establish in this particular study is that a barrier to low-income people eating fruits and vegetables is the cost. My dietitian and nutritionist friends tell me that many low-income people do not buy fruits and vegetables because they have to feed their kids and they go for calories first. So we're not trying to do everything. We're just trying to establish that if you take away the barrier of cost, that they will eat more fruits and vegetables. So talk to each other, and then we'll come back to plenary. So go ahead.
I'm sketches on almost everything.
Okay. So what's the basis for this?
Well, it's fruits and vegetables. So it's not establishing the benefit of fruits and vegetables.
That's got to be measured.
That's harder to do. And it's not establishing the benefit of fruits and vegetables to reduce health costs, if any.
No, well, that's, it's possible.
Discuss Channing says it doesn't make it true.
Yeah, it's possible. There's other evidence that a diet of fruits and vegetables, a diet of junk food, is going to reduce health costs. And so maybe that can,
I'm not saying it's not.
yeah. So that could be added to the observation. Give people this stuff, and they will actually have that diet, and that diet has, according to some evidence, already got benefits. So you put the two together, and it's something like that.
There's a little more idealism in this Ontario fruits and vegetables, which is very seasonal.
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up in a few seconds.
So it's all going to happen in the summer.
And you go back to the chips in the winter, or French fries.
So I'm just going to leave you with those thoughts that you've discussed with other people in the audience. A woman here in Toronto who's done quite a bit of work with food insecure households, Valerie Tarasov, came out with a paper recently, and she looked at annual health care costs in contrast to food secure households. In households with marginal food insecurity, the annual health care costs were 23% higher. When it was moderate, in other words, there was more food insecurity, the annual health care costs went up 49%. When there was severe food insecurity, annual health care costs went up 121%. So I just want to make the point that in food insecure households, it's not just the issue of people not having enough food and perhaps being hungry, as sad as that is. It's also the issue that they are having higher healthcare costs. And then it begs the question, is food security or food insecurity a problem of sufficiency or poverty? And I would come down very strongly on the side of poverty. In Canada, we do not have a food sufficiency problem. We have plenty of food. Remember, we waste 40%. Hugh Siegel, who is now here at U of T, I haven't had a chance to meet him, I'd love to. All the time that he was a senator, he talked a lot about the possibility of a guaranteed annual income. And there was a project in Manitoba in the 70s, and they tested in the town of Dauphin how a guaranteed annual income would work. And despite all the fears, it turned out that there was almost no reduction in hours worked, except for women who chose to stay home with young children, elderly parents, or disabled family members. Now, this guaranteed annual income idea is being repeated in Ontario in 3 communities. I think Hamilton is one of them. And it'll be interesting to find out what we see in 2017, 2018, and how this works. But a guaranteed annual income would be another way to address poverty and to address food insecurity. I had mentioned meat before, and one of the reasons that my colleagues in agricultural economics talk about the fact that we have to grow more and more food is that they assume that China is going to consume more and more meat. In 1982, the average Chinese person ate 13 kilograms of meat per year. They're now up to 63, and that's rising to 93 by 2030 if nothing is done to change the trend. However, the Chinese government has a new goal, and they have a way of meeting goals that some other countries don't have achieved. Their new goal is to go back from 63 to 30 kilograms of meat per person per year. They want to do this because they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 billion tons. And they want to lessen the country's problems with obesity and diabetes and other associated diseases. So this was reported in The Guardian about a year ago. I haven't seen articles or papers since then, but I think we should be careful about the assumption that the Chinese are just going to keep eating more and more meat. Now, I want to say a little bit about healthy food from healthy animals. This is a lamb, and this lamb is unpastured. Sheep and cattle are ruminants. They have 4 stomachs. We are monogastrics. We have 1. In spite of the fact that when my daughter was really small and she would not want to finish her first course, and then she would say that she had room for her second course, I'd say, yeah, but you couldn't finish your first course. And she said, oh yeah, but this is my dessert stomach. So she claimed to have 2 stomachs, but all other humans have 1. We're monogastrics. The thing about ruminants, the animals with 4 stomachs, is that they have microbes and bacteria in their rumen. They can eat grass, timothy, orchard grass. They can eat clover, alfalfa, all these forage crops that we cannot eat. Well, we can eat them, but we're not going to get food value from them. They do. Because of the microbes in their rumen, they can eat grasses and forages, clovers, alfalfa, and they can convert that to meat and milk. We can't. There's a lot of land in the world that is agricultural land that is not suitable for growing potatoes and wheat and corn and rice and some of the crops that we eat directly. So if all that land, we could choose to not use it at all, but if we do use it for forages, and I'm going to make the case a little bit later, that forages are exactly what we want to improve soil quality. Partly because they're perennials and they're covering the soil all the time, partly because of their root structure, but they are very good for improving soil quality, which of course, in my opinion, is the basis of agriculture. And a well-managed association between ruminants and forages can lead to very ecological systems. Furthermore, meat and milk from forage-fed animals have higher conjugated linoleic acids, CLAs, and omega-3 levels, and minimal or no antibiotics, because animals are usually healthier when they're grazing and unpastured. Now, in animal ag production, one of the things that we've been working on over the years, and I have to hand it to my colleagues in animal science, feed conversion ratios have gone to a lot of efficiency compared to what they were. So this is the mass of dry feed per body mass of game. So a chicken used to take 6 or 7 kilograms of dry grain to get 1 kilogram of meat. Today it takes a chicken about 1.8 to 1.7 kilograms of grain to get the same kilogram of meat. It's remarkable how animal scientists have been able to improve this efficiency. We can't go much further. We can't go much further. We're never going to get to 1-to-1. Yes, question there.
Is that dependent on penning the chickens so that they essentially have no activity other than eating?
The question is that dependent on penning the chickens? Partially, but even if you have chickens grazing, you can still get feed conversion. It might be 2 or 2.5, but it's still way less than the 6. The genetics has really improved. To maximize the efficiency, you might put them in cages, but you would still get pretty good efficiency. I think I heard another question. Perhaps not. We'll carry on.
But I was asking this,
Yes.
how are we sure that by improving genetics and getting this high ratio, low ratio, I should say,
Yes.
there are no, how should I say,
Side effects.
side effects and more on long-term effects. More
Right. That's an excellent question. How do we know that there are no side effects or long-term effects? The thing is, we don't for sure, because so much focus has been put on improving the feed conversion ratio. There's now a lot more attention paid to some of the other issues, including meat quality. And one of the things that we found is that the bone structure in legs of broilers, those are the types of chickens that put on meat, their legs tend to be quite weak, and they can sometimes put on weight so quickly that they suffer because their legs can't support them. So now the breeders are going back to make sure that they're rebuilding that. And so there are side effects, and there are others that I don't want to get into now, but I think that's an excellent point. And again, it's an issue that in any part of our lives, if we focus too much on one efficiency, we may lose on other aspects. Now, the challenge then of animal agricultural production is to provide the benefits of animal products while feeding animals feed, including food processing co-products, and not human edible food. I think quite often when we think about livestock, we just think about what they eat, and we think that whatever they eat, it's kind of like a homogeneous mash. But I think it's really important to make the distinction between human inedible, so grass, clover, alfalfa, all those things that we cannot convert with our one stomach and that ruminants can. And there are a whole host of co-products in the food processing industry that could be used in the livestock sector rather than going into human food. There's a company in the Netherlands called Banda, and Banda makes it their business to collect all kinds of products from food processors, and they bring it all together. And so they don't just take all the apple peelings that you might peel if you're making some kind of a fruit salad and feed it to beef cattle. They very carefully take all the ingredients from the food processing industry, they test it, they put it into well-defined rations, and then that goes into livestock feed. My cousin actually ran a business where he was accepting waste from Canada Bread. All the bread and all the pastry products that were no longer suitable for human consumption, and his genius was to figure out, he designed a machine that would automatically take all the wrappers off, and they just had the bread and bakery products. They chopped it up, and then it went down the road to another cousin who had a feed mill, and he put that into rations for livestock. One of the very interesting things was that they could put no more than 11% of human pastry products in any livestock ration. And do you know why? The salt content was too high for the livestock. So if they went higher than 11%, the salt content for the livestock was too high, and it did not make an ideal ration. Yes?
What happens if they have the high salt content?
How's that
I mean,
again?
how does it affect, if, let's say, it's-
Well, when livestock, their rations are balanced very, very carefully. And if they have too much salt, it means that they're excluding some other nutrients or micronutrients that they might want to get. You had a,
Would livestock process things like mold differently than?
yes. Yeah, now you have to be very careful about DON, D-O-N, and I can't quite remember what it stands for, but that's a type of mold, and you have to be very careful in grain, and you can have a very low percentage that they can manage that we couldn't, particularly ruminants. But if it gets too high, then they can't manage it either. So you do have to manage for that. Now, we just did a recent paper, my student and I. It's not yet published, it's in prep, and we're hoping to send it off soon. And we've been looking at the land in Ontario. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. You had a question?
Yeah, just from the last slide, did the waste include meat waste as well, or was it all vegetable?
No, I think they were using some meat waste, but that was separated and dealt with differently. And it would be, you have to be very, very careful with that. And there are strict rules about what and when you can feed that. And I don't want to get into all the rules of that, but they, in the Netherlands in particular, they're very, very careful about that. And food safety is a real high priority. They also have an anaerobic digester on site. And if there is anything that comes in that does not meet specs for animal consumption, it goes into the anaerobic digester, and then it produces methane, and they still have the sludge at the end that they can use as fertilizer. So it kind of tumbles down in value. So my student and I, Sarah, looked at, and Kira is also working on this. We're looking at how we could use land differently in Ontario. Right now, we use over 1 million hectares, 1.2 million hectares, for feed production. That is products that animals eat. And that could be grains that might be suitable for people, but we're growing them and dedicating them as livestock feed. So we looked at how we could reduce this by feeding monogastrics like chickens and pigs more co-products, by making sure that ruminants eat almost exclusively forages. And our calculations are that we could have about 700,000 more hectares available for human food production if we just use some of these techniques that could be available. It's a design question. Now, whether or not we can actually get people to eat that much less meat, and whether or not we can get farmers to switch their systems is another question. But when we design it according to what is required and what is available, we think this is a gain that could be made. We do recognize that there's a value in livestock as a battery of nutrients. For example, if a farmer grows a crop of oats, and this field that my two friends are standing in, that's Ken Lang and Martin Entz. Martin Entz here, he's an agronomist from the University of Manitoba. I am very proud to say that he's a friend of mine. I think he's the best agronomist in Canada. He's an excellent agronomist. And this is Ken Lang. Ken Lang's an organic farmer from near St. Thomas. He has been growing organic vegetables for years. And one of the things that conventional farmers criticize organic farmers for is that they do too much tillage, particularly in vegetable production. In organic systems, farmers cannot use herbicides to control weeds, so they've traditionally relied on tillage. Ken has figured out how to grow organic vegetables with a no-tillage system with horses. It's remarkable. Yes.
What is tillage?
Tillage is a plow. That primary tillage is turning the soil right over, or it could be a disc. They're big round discs, and they go through the soil and they turn it partially, or a cultivator. But they work the soil, and some of the problems with tillage are that then you're getting oxygen into the system and you're burning carbon that's in the soil. And sometimes you get more erosion because you've been tilling it. So my students know that the gospel according to Martin is to keep your soil covered. And I promised them that that will be on the midterm and on the exam. And I keep telling them, and I keep telling them, and it's on the midterm and the exam. And I've met students that I had 20, 30 years ago, and they still remember the gospel according to Martin. Ken Lang has been able to farm organically, and just within the last 4 years, when he should be retiring, because one of his daughters wants to take over the farm, he started to play with how to make no-till work on an organic farm. And I don't want to get into the details of it, but it's a really fascinating project. Anyway, he's standing in a crop of oats. And oats are often, they could be used for people. You know, we can make oatmeal and that type of thing. But if the crop perhaps goes bad and it doesn't quite meet the quality specs for human consumption, then I think it's good to have livestock available that can eat it, that can still capture those nutrients, store them in meat or milk, and make them available to us. Now, I want to start talking about wasted food. The number, 1 billion is the number of extra people that could be fed if we globally applied the best current methods to reduce wasted food. And I see this slide is a bit dated. I used to always say food waste, and my colleagues are still, for the most part, saying food waste. I think the noun should be food. It's food that we're dealing with, and it becomes wasted. It's not just food waste as maybe paper waste or some other kind of waste. This is food we're talking about. So I think the adjective should be the wasted. So I should have said the best current methods to reduce wasted food. These are current methods, and there's nothing here that has to be invented. We're losing 1 billion, we could feed 1 billion extra people just by applying the best current methods we have. In developing countries, the biggest problem is right after harvest and post-harvest storage. And rats and mice and insects get in and get at the food, and that's how a lot of food is wasted. Here, of the 40% of food that is wasted in Canada, half of it is wasted in our households, just because we buy too much and don't manage it properly. Martin de Groot, no, sorry, not Martin de Groot, Martin Gooch, a friend of mine, has estimated that in Canada, the value of wasted food is $31 billion. We're wasting $31 billion just because we're not managing our food chain properly.
That would be a year.
Yes, that's per year. Yeah, that's per year. Yes.
And that's for the entire food production chain?
Yes, that's the whole value chain.
So this is not picking or not putting a product into the market because it doesn't look good, it's considered a food waste?
Yes, so that does include, as you say, food that does not meet specs or aesthetic specs and therefore is not put into the market. That's true. But we might talk about various degrees, because if it's still in the farm and it doesn't leave the farm and it hasn't had energy put into it to move it or to be processed, and all the nutrients go back in the soil, that's a different, I would argue that's a different level of waste than if we put a whole lot of energy into it and processing capacity and move it around and then don't consume it. There was another point here, yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering that number you gave about food waste,
Yes,
that's obviously throughout the food chain?
yes, the whole food chain.
Yeah, so do you have a breakdown at what stage, how much does it roughly go?
Yes, if you look at the report by Martin Gooch, and I have the name of it here. I'm going to make these slides available to Meta, by the way, and she can make them available to you. And I encourage you to go to this report that Martin Gooch wrote, and it's all broken down as what parts of the chain contribute what to the various levels of wasted food. Now, The average household in Canada, and this data may be a couple, 3 years old now, but on average, we spend $153 a week on food. If we assume that half the 40% that's wasted, in other words, 20%, is wasted in households, then the cost of tossing our food is $31 a week. Now, another interesting statistic that I just saw within the last year is this. Organic shoppers spend $27 per week more than those who buy non-organic food. And I found that really interesting. So when I put these two ideas together, I said to myself, we could just stop, we could buy organic, we could stop wasting, assuming that it's a regular household that buys non-organic food and wastes 20%. We could just buy organic, we could stop wasting and save $4 a week. How's that for a solution? Yes?
I have a question, is that among organic shoppers,
Yes?
well, is there a difference in food waste between non-organic shoppers and organic shoppers?
I don't know. That, as far as I know, that has not been tested.
But, well, anyway, it would be difficult to tell because that's not the same kind of households. They won't have the same
Right.
Well, social economic
Yeah.
needs anyway.
That's true. They're not the same kind of households. And I'm just saying that if you have a household that's non-organic and they waste food, buy organic, stop wasting. I'm not saying that organic households do that. I'm just saying that they could, and then they could save $4 a week.
Organic is so good, you must eat it all.
Is there any evidence that organic food has any more nutrition in it than non-organic? I read that there is not, and it's a middle-class fact.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about organic in a few slides from now, and I'm going to get into that. And if I don't deal with it satisfactorily at that point, then ask me again. You had a point here?
Actually, I haven't asked for you, sir.
Well, he's going to deal with it later on.
Can we come to that when I get to the organic food, and we'll deal with it. I'll make sure that becomes part of the discussion. I do want to hear what you have to say then. Balancing production and consumption. Remember I said at the beginning that we want to balance production and consumption. Suppose that mainstream agriculture had evolved differently, and that we produced high-quality food with yields that are 19 to 25% lower than they are today. Organic yields are now about 20 to 25% lower than mainstream agriculture. They were 20 to 25% lower in 1970, in 1980, in 1990, in 2000, and 2010. Organic is not standing still. As non-organic yields have been going up, so have organic. Organic has been behind, and organic farmers don't have the tools or the options that non-organic farmers do, but they've been pretty consistently within the 20 to 25% yield disadvantage all the way through. Now, could we also imagine that food waste or wasted food was at 15% rather than 40%? In such a world of 15% wasted food, would we aspire to produce 25% more food so that we could meet our goal of wasting 40%? I think it's unlikely. And it's something that I think we should think about. Now, there's our website for the group at Guelph that works on wasted food. One of the things I found, I grew up in a Mennonite community, and I pretty much had done my dash with guilt by the time I was 21 and left home. And then in our research, we found out that most people feel guilty about wasting food, and the more guilty they feel, the less they waste. And I thought, aha, so maybe there is some value to guilt. People with more food awareness waste less food. the more you're aware of food, regardless of how that awareness comes to you, you might garden, you might have a child with some kind of eating disability, or there's something that they cannot eat. The more you become aware of food, the less you tend to waste food. And I've always thought that wasted food was an environmental issue. Most people think it's a social issue. And that was interesting for me to see, because my partner is a social scientist, and then now she can say, I told you so. The principles of addressing food waste are reduction, reduction, reduction. That's number one. We need to reduce food waste first. Then we can feed hungry people. Now, there's a big issue in some people's minds with rescuing food to give to low-income people, and they feel there's a dignity issue here. And I think that's something that we have to address. I have a colleague in engineering at the University of Guelph who's looking at ways to take any food that might be left over after a banquet in a restaurant or whatever, to puree it and heat it to deal with any bacteria, and then make it available in a pureed form. So he's working on that. I don't know how far he's going to get with that. But at any rate, if we can't reduce, we should get it back to people somehow. One of the biggest ways we can reduce at home is with leftovers. And I've been astonished at how many people have told me over the last 5 to 10 years that I've been talking about wasted food, that they just say flatly, I don't do leftovers. And I don't know why. Because sometimes they taste better. And that's the best way in a household to reduce. Then, if we cannot use food for people, I think it should go to livestock, and that's where I talked about Banda. That's where I talked about co-products. And there are some parts of wasted food, or some stages, that are not suitable for livestock that could be suitable for insects. And there's a young farmer near Peterborough who is working with insects. He's got crickets in drawers. And there's some research to look at how we could feed crickets wasted food. I've had cricket banana bread. It was great. And there are lots of ways that we can use insects that we haven't explored. Although when I was in Uganda, I found that people were selling grubs and so on, and that it's already quite common. Yes?
I had an invasive species dinner in New Orleans a few years ago. Termite streusel. Delicious.
So an invasive species dinner with termite strudel. Livestock, if it's not suitable for livestock or for insects, then I think it would tumble down to anaerobic digestion. I like anaerobic digestion because we can capture both energy and nutrients. Anaerobic digestion produces methane. We can capture the methane, generate electricity, and we still have the sludge or the nutrients to put onto fields. Biodiesel, we capture the energy, and with compost, we just capture the nutrients. The last thing is landfill. But we should not be too happy with ourselves about diverting from landfill. That's the last in the line. And the folks at Guelph, in Guelph we have one of the best records in Ontario for diverting from landfill. But one of the things that the city waste management people are worried about is that some people think, oh well, it's diverted from landfill, so that's a good thing. So they put it into recycling or into the compost. The first thing is reduce. It's most important to reduce. And so by reducing food waste and not having to produce excess food, we all save carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide emissions, energy, water, all those things that would have to be used to produce food. We save some biodiversity, soil quality, labor, money, future capacity, and maybe most importantly, respect. Now,
And energy.
yes, that was there. But thank you. It's worth emphasizing. Now, I think that what we need in Ontario from JK to grade 12 is a curriculum, Not just some of the ad hoc things that some teachers do, and there are some excellent teachers, and they're very creative, and they're including food skills and food awareness and food literacy in their classes. In my opinion, this has to be part of the curriculum, and I think we really have to do this. And one of the objections I hear is that people will say, well, school boards, you know, they're so busy teaching math and science and English and history that they don't have time to teach food skills and food awareness. I would argue that they'll do a better job of teaching math if they link it to food skills and food awareness. They'll do a better job of teaching science if they link it to food skills and food awareness. They'll even do a better job of teaching history if they link it to food skills and food awareness. This is something that touches our lives 3 times a day, if not more, including snacks. It's something that we're aware of all our lives, and I think this could work really well. I'm going to give you another couple minutes just to talk about this and answer this question. Is this really beyond implementation? So chat with your neighbors for a couple minutes and just see what you think about this idea.
Great idea.
So, is it beyond implementation?
Well, my problem with it, when you start teaching in schools, is what you teach. And if you teach a broad range of approaches and information approaches, I have a problem. If you teach some particular person's agenda, I have a problem with that.
Some agendas that you find more
Well, if someone, for example, told them that they shouldn't do anything but organic
but suppose you are doing things like waste, for example, being aware of the nutrient content of different chemicals.
to avoid talking aware of nutrient content is a worthwhile process. I could see teaching that. I would see teaching alternative approaches to agriculture. Making people aware of growing things.
Yeah, that's a great thing for kids to do.
It's a great thing to do, and you can. So I don't object to that. I mean, maybe there's 100 other things you could teach in food skills, but that's not different issue.
There's things like baking. When you're baking, discover.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to wrap that up in the next 10 seconds. Now, I want to switch to a few challenges more directly. In our research group, we looked at the challenges in agriculture that are both transformative and urgent. So transformation, think about this cow here on top of the bedding pack. She's thinking transformatively, while all of her mates are just business as usual. She's transformational. And these are calves, and if you've ever tried to feed dairy calves, you'll know all about urgency. So the challenges are both transformative and urgent, and the two that stood out were for farmers adapting to the effects of climate change. How are we going to deal with too much water or too little water, or temperatures that are too high or too low at the wrong time? And how are we going to deal with ecosystem function or the resilience of ecosystems? There's a big issue with changes in weather and climate that could affect the incidence and severity of pests. And this is something that we're finding out more and more in agriculture. Even here in Canada, some of the pests that used to be killed by winters are no longer as easily killed. And in drought years, lower yielding crops take up fewer nutrients, and therefore we have more nitrogen left in the soil. This is a picture of a field here at the bottom. This picture was in 2013 in Ontario. And there's a problem with increasing erosion if we have unexpected, intense rainfall events. And that is more likely to happen as climate changes, along with drought. In the first 6 months of this year, the average global surface temperature was 0.94 degrees centigrade above the 1950 to 1980 average. In 2017, it's the second hottest first 6 months on record, behind only 2016. 2014, 15, and 16 each broke global surface temperature records previously set in 2010 and 2005. Now, when it comes to cropping, my colleague Bill Dean is managing long-term trials. And on these trials, we have some rotations where there is just corn, 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 corn every year. And we have another very simple rotation of corn, soy, corn, soy. So we've got corn, 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 soy, corn, soy. And then we get into the more complex rotations of corn, soy, wheat, underseeded by red clover, corn with a couple of years of alfalfa. And what we found is that when corn and soybean were integrated into the more complex rotations, the yields of the corn and soybean were higher, but especially in bad years. There was a difference between the yield in a normal year, if you had a complex crop rotation of corn, soy, wheat, red clover, but in a bad year, the difference was even more pronounced. And by bad, I mean too little water or too much water. Yes?
So this is just rotations. Did they try intercropping as well?
In this particular trial, no, but they did impose tillage. So they had one half of the plots that were no-till, and the other side included tillage. And in no-till, if you really want to make it work, it showed very clearly that the more complex rotations helped to make the no-till work. If you just had the simple rotations, it was much harder to make it work without tillage. Intercropping, I spent my master's and PhD doing intercropping. I love it. In this experiment, we didn't do it. Yes?
And were these conventional methods?
Yes.
Like herbicides and so on?
Yes, this is a conventional experiment that was started in 1979 by other people. My colleague Bill Dean is now managing it. And because it's a long-term trial, they managed it that way. That was the way they committed to doing it at that time. There's another long-term trial in Manitoba by my colleague Martin Entz, the one I told you is the best agronomist in Canada. That one's been running about 25 years with conventional versus organic and several types of treatments. And he's got some fascinating data. If you want to find that, I would say search. Don't use Google. I never use Google. Use DuckDuckGo. But search for Martin Entz, University of Manitoba, or the Glenn Lee rotation trials. And there's a lot of really good information there.
How do you spell this last name?
Entz is spelled E-N-T-Z. E-N-T-Z. Yes?
I didn't quite catch. When you rotate, it's corn, soybean, wheat, and what is the fourth?
Corn, soybean, wheat, as well as red clover.
Red what?
Clover. Clover.
What is that?
It's like a forage. It's like alfalfa.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about going into diversity. There are about 350,000 plant species. Almost 200,000 of them are flowering and that have edible parts useful to humans. How many species do you think we actually use for food? 100? That's actually a pretty good guess. It's less than 300, but only 17 provide 90% of our food. And the big three, corn, wheat, rice, are over 50% of our food, just from 3 species. If we're going to grow, or if we're going to manage into the future with climate change and variability, then we have to go beyond just diversity of variety. We don't just need more wheat varieties or more soy varieties or more corn varieties. We need more species. This is my colleague Yuban Zhen. He's at the University of Guelph. This is bitter melon. And bitter melon is a great thing to use if you have diabetes. And the Chinese community uses it quite a bit. And we were successful in growing it in a high tunnel organically with very excellent yields here in Ontario.
What's a high tunnel?
A high tunnel is like a greenhouse, but it does not have any supplementary heat. So instead of just a low tunnel, it's a fairly high tunnel. So it extends the season at the beginning of the season by a few weeks, and again at the end of the season, just because you have the high tunnel there. Adapting to climate change, I think in varieties of plant species, we need workhorse varieties that just plod along, not necessarily the racehorse varieties. We need to keep dependable class 1, 2, and 3 land for agriculture. I think we need to use a wider variety of crop species, as I've mentioned. We can use no-till forages and organic amendments to maintain and improve soil organic matter levels and reduce wasted food. Now, there are a lot of people who would argue that we've gone out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene. We've had the Holocene for about 10,000 years, and I first heard this notion by Thomas Berry. Actually, he was talking about eras, and he argued that we're going out of the Cenozoan, and we're going into either the Technozoan or the Ecozoic. And he argues that we have to think about what we want. Regardless, now geologists are saying that the relatively stable Holocene that we've known is probably changing, and we have to deal with what we've created as the Anthropocene. And then we get into planetary boundaries. There's a group from Scandinavia, and Stephanie All produced this paper in 2015. Some of the things that are way beyond the planetary boundaries are genetic diversity. There's too much phosphorus, too much nitrogen in the ecosystem. We've goosed the natural systems. Climate change, in their analysis, still has a lot of undetermined effects, but in agriculture, it's increasingly becoming evident that it's not good. Yes?
So when you say we've gone beyond the boundaries with genetic diversity, is that related to genetic modification? Could you just
No,
say
that
something about
actually, what I should say is that we've gone beyond the boundaries of not having enough genetic diversity. In other words, we've got too few species, and we're losing resilience. And what they looked at was, then they had functional diversity. So they had genetic diversity and they had functional diversity. And it turns out that functional diversity may be just as important. There are some of the species that provide similar functions that we're starting to lose. And once you start losing functions in an ecosystem, then we're into trouble. That's what they mean at this point. Yes?
So just looking at that nitrogen phosphorus
Yes.
segment there, we need nitrogen and phosphorus to grow plants, but we're augmenting it too much? Is it, like, I just don't understand
That's the argument that they're making, that globally we've applied too much phosphorus and too much nitrogen to ecosystems, and it's leaking out of the ecosystem. Nitrogen is going up into the air as nitrous oxide, ammonia, and it's going into the groundwater as nitrate. And as we know, phosphorus is going into Lake Simcoe and Lake Erie and other places. There's a bit too much. I want to say a little bit about nitrogen fertilizer. About 48% of people today depend directly on the Haber-Bosch process. We've only had nitrogen fertilizer since 1908, when Fritz Haber figured out in a lab how to manufacture it. His buddy Bosch figured out how to scale it up in 1911. So since, did I say 2008? It's 1908. So Fritz was in 1908. Bosch was in